Up next we have Dan Bailey, but I did want to share with you again the live shot from out the window here in Breckenridge, Colorado. This is Mount Baldy, and some of the locals actually hike to the top of that mountain and ski down it. There are no ski lifts on it, but it's a lot of pristine powder. Now up next is our speaker, Dan Bailey, and Dan is, depending on where you live around the globe, he's really focused a lot on wildfires, brush fire, range fire, forest fires, desert fires, grass fires, hill fires, peat fires, or veld fires. Regardless, wildland fires are affecting more and more structures and populations each year. Dan has spent decades committed to the science, research, and education, communication, and training of wildland fire prevention, preparedness, and mitigation. Now serving as president and chairman of the board of directors for the International Association of Wildland Fire, Dan has increased the vulnerabilities to people and communities living in or near the wildland fire interface. He's discussed that increased vulnerability between that interface. So we have a little intro video for Dan. Let's go ahead and roll that as Dan talks a little bit about what he does.
Communities and lives in constant danger. When does this imbalance become our collective responsibility?
99% of the public feel that fire is someone else's responsibility and they have no responsibility. Mr. or Mrs. Homeowner, you have a responsibility. You built where you built your home, and you have to take some of the responsibility for dealing with wildland fire. A lot of people feel that moving from cities to the wildland-urban interface, that they have the same type of fire protection that they had in the city, that they will be able to dial 911 and there'll be a fire truck roll into their yard and deal with a fire that's even in their structure or in the wildlands around the structure. And that's not the case in 90% of the areas around the United States. So there's this perceived impression that people have that they're covered by a local fire department, and they're not.
All right, thank you, and good morning. I feel like it's a privilege to be with the group here this morning. I've been here since day one and have learned a great deal, and I think that some of the discussions that have occurred have been right on track from some of the things that we've been dealing with within the wildland fire arena, especially the issue of how we can get the message out to the public. What I'm going to be talking about is living on the edge, the wildland-urban interface, and I think that we can talk about that in a lot of different aspects as we kind of go through this presentation. But you just need to go back, and I think from the weather briefing this morning, we are just in January. We're already seeing Santa Ana winds and high fire danger in Southern California. This week, a couple fires that already occurred in California. Burned a few houses. Kansas had a wildland-urban interface fire on Monday of this week, burned several structures. And so we're already beginning to see some of the wildland fire activity occurring around the United States this early in the year. One of the things that I talk about in this presentation, as Dave just mentioned, is the vulnerability, the increased vulnerability for not only people that are out living in the wildland-urban interface. And I always love this picture because this person is, I guess, going to tell the fire to stop when it gets to his particular house. But when you look at the issues that are affecting communities and homeowners around the United States as well as around the globe, it's a major problem. And all you have to do is kind of look at the faces of people impacted by these fires to understand the real ramifications that are occurring out there. And this is a scene I think that's all too familiar. Communities that are being impacted by wildland fires that in the past have not had any kind of issue with wildland fires in the past. We have had so many areas in the United States that have been so built up over the last few years, and I'm going to talk more specifically about that in a couple minutes. But this issue of communities and people impacted by wildland fire is becoming a huge problem throughout the United States. One of the things that I really want to talk about and kind of focus on is kind of the backstory about dealing with wildland fire in the United States. There's so many complications about the issue of wildland fire and how we're communicating to the public, how we're dealing with communities, how we're dealing with political leaders, that I'm going to share kind of a little bit of the background about wildland fire as it relates to that. And I want to touch a little bit on the firefighters, the first responders that are out there dealing with these kind of fires, to give you a little bit better understanding of some of the issues that are affecting not only federal and state agencies, but local jurisdictions as well. I think everybody's familiar with what happened in Yarnell in June of this past year and some of the issues that have surfaced as a result of that. We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. I'm a firm believer that we can really kind of take a look at the past and really kind of learn from the past to kind of see what's going to happen in the future. And so I kind of scratched my head and I thought, okay, one of the things that we hear a lot as I travel around the country is that a lot of the public feels that the wildland urban interface fire problem is something new. It's something that has just kind of started. And one of the things that I like to talk about is how history of wildland fires has changed the whole wildland fire climate in the United States. So what I want to do is talk about a few fires. 1871, October 8th through the 14th in Wisconsin, 1,500 lives were lost on the Peshtigo fire. 3.8 million acres burned. It was the nation's largest and most devastating forest fire, 1871. 15 years after that fire, the first wildland firefighters were engaged. And in the United States, what happened as a result of that, the first wildland firefighters, as it says here in this slide, was Troop M of the U.S. military that took command of the fire protection for Yellowstone Park. And it really kind of kicked into operation how we deal with wildland fires in the United States. 1889, I think this is a really small fire. Not too many people know about it, but on June 6th, a 60-plus acre, 64-acre fire in the state of Washington inside Seattle. It was the first wildland urban interface before the term wildland urban interface was ever kind of defined. It burned only 64 acres, but burned $15 million worth of structures and forest within the city. And when you look at today's dollars, that was about a $500 million fire, 64 acres. (1894), and I have a video on this one. Whoops, no audio. Yeah.
After a 2-month drought combined with high temperatures, several small
Well,
fires started in the forests of Pine County. At the time, loggers would strip trees of their branches, scattering them on the ground. They would burn the debris before moving on. However, some loggers did not. That leftover flammable debris littered the ground. Also contributing to the Great Fire was a temperature inversion that trapped the gases from the fires. The air came rushing down into the fires to create a vortex or tornado of
today's world if that fire occurred again. when you look at that fire that same year, when you think about fire protection in the United States, the first lookout tower was built that actually, started the process all over the United States of having fire towers, not only with federal and state agencies, but looking at this whole situation. I'm hoping the audio works on this one. In 1910, in Idaho and Montana, I'm going to go back up and make sure the speaker's working here.
No, we just need to turn it up here.
Oh, okay.
You can't talk when the audio is.
Oh, okay.
Or pat your head, rub your belly.
It began with an ominously dry spring in 1910. The first wildfires in the Northern Rockies flared on the unheard-of month of April. The drought built. Then in late July, huge thunderstorms barreled through the Clearwater, St. Joe, and Coeur d'Alene ranges, kindling hundreds of small lightning fires. Meanwhile, the steam locomotives of the new Milwaukee Road, which had slashed through the Bitterroots the year before, sprayed sparks through the dry forest. The fledgling Forest Service couldn't extinguish all of these small fires. In early August, President Taft ordered troops in. By mid-August, 5,000 men were fighting fires on the Forest Service payroll. A few days later, a young ranger wrote his mother from a backcountry fire camp. "Don't worry about me, as there is no danger to speak of at present, and the newspapers exaggerate things." And then, on the morning of August 20, the wind freshened to a gale. This palooser, as the old-timers called it, blasted up against an enormous swath of mountains from the Clearwater River to Glacier National Park. Hundreds of small fires were whipped into flame and blown into one giant fire front. That afternoon, firefighters looked up and saw huge black thunderclouds heading their way. These were, in fact, columns of smoke and ash. A full-fledged firestorm had begun roaring, as one survivor said, like 1,000 steam locomotives over 1,000 steel trestles. Fire crews were trapped throughout the backcountry. Hundreds raced for clearings, creeks, and cabins. More than 80 were incinerated. Many others survived after dramatic runs to safety. Rescue trains were dispatched to gather up fleeing work crews on the Milwaukee Road. Several trains full of evacuees rode out the fire in tunnels. The towns of Grand Forks, Falcon, Taft, Haugen, and DeBorgia were reduced to charcoal. The area's biggest town, Wallace, was in the grip of panic. Hundreds of townspeople fled by train. One backcountry firefighter reported seeing a flaming star falling from the sky and igniting an entire mountainside. It was a burning airborne ember, one of thousands sent aloft. Another landed on a bucket of grease in Wallace, igniting a fire that consumed 1/3 of the town. That night, in the Holocaust above Wallace, Ranger Ed Pulaski led a desperate crew into the only shelter he could find, an old mine shaft. Hot gas and smoke filled the shaft. The entire crew passed out. When dawn arrived on August 21st, 5 were dead. Yet the other 41, including Pulaski, stumbled into Wallace, burned and nearly blind. In Avery, on the St. Joe River in Idaho, flames approached from 4 directions. Martial law was declared. The town was ordered evacuated. Women and children escaped by train, but the men, along with the black troops of the 25th Infantry, the famous Buffalo Soldiers, were trapped. In desperation, they set a backfire. The wind suddenly died down, and Avery survived. The worst was over. In September, rain and snow finally fell on the gray ash of the Northern Rockies, far too late to save the forests. Not a sprig of green remains, reported one ranger. At least, said one other survivor, there will be no more trouble with forest fires. No forests were left to burn. The country, he said, is wiped clean. This is Jim Kirshner for Spokesman.com.
The reason I show this is because the 1910 fires in Idaho and Montana were really pivotal in changing the way nationally that we deal with wildland fire in the United States. It was, as it mentioned in the video, the beginning of the U.S. Forest Service. There wasn't any real organization to firefighting at that particular point in time. And as a result of the 1910 fire, federal and state agencies began to look at the training programs and engage more community and local people in the firefighting efforts that were a big part of the U.S. Forest Service and the other federal and state agencies. In 1918, another major wildland fire. 1,000 people died as a result of this in Michigan. $73 million in losses. Another one that really kind of set the record in terms of engaging the political leaders in trying to better understand how to deal with this growing problem. Again, 1918. For everyone in the room, this is a good statistic. How many knew this? 1933, the first fire weather forecasting service was initiated dealing with wildland fire, forest fires in the United States, and really kind of set the stage how the Weather Service would interact with the wildland fire community for years and years to come. 1935 is another important date in the history of wildland fire. A lot of you have heard about the 10 a.m. policy. It's really a controversial kind of discussion that pops up during the fire season with a lot of media attention over the years. In 1935, the U.S. Forest Service, along with federal and state agencies, said that every wildland fire that occurred had to be put out by 10 a.m. the day following the fire, with every amount of resources that was available. Of course, in today's world, that controversy has changed a bit, and in terms of how that policy is being discussed with the use of fire for natural fire in large wilderness areas, which I will talk a little bit about here in a couple minutes. 1947, again in Maine, northeastern part of the country, wildland fire, forest fire, 16 lives were lost, 205,000 acres. 1948, we all heard this year, and the public began to understand what hotshot crews were as a result of the fatalities with the hotshot crew in Prescott, Arizona. 1948 was the first year that hotshot crews were developed, and the first crew was in Southern California on the Los Padres National Forest. 1949, another year historically that really changed the way that we think about how firefighters deal with these fires. In Man Gulch in Montana, 12 smoke jumpers died as a result of fighting a fire on a ridgetop just out of Helena. It's the fire that Red Skies of Montana, the movie, kind of replicated, and has still a lot of discussion in the wildland community today. 1953, the principles of organizing for fighting fires were developed, kind of set the stage for how things would be dealt with by federal and state agencies. The first air tanker drop in the United States dealing with wildland fire, 1955. 1956, the Cleveland National Forest, we started seeing large fires and the media starting to gain a little bit more attention and understanding about what this phenomenon was all about. 1956, helicopters were first used. The National Interagency Fire Center, as it was originally called, the Boise Interagency Fire Center, was developed in 1965, and then later named the National Center, where all of the wildland fire activities occur in the United States. And if you're not familiar with the Interagency Fire Center, and all of the information they provide, a wealth of information on predictive services, on all kinds of background information and statistics about wildland fires. And you just have to Google National Interagency, or NIFC. In those early days of NIFC, it was a small group. Today, it involves all of the federal agencies, including the Weather Service, FEMA, U.S. Fire Administration, and the state foresters. 1970 saw another major fire in California history that changed California and how California dealt with wildland fires. In 1971, a year following that fire, FireScope was developed in California. And what's important about this particular date and what FireScope did, FireScope set into motion the issue of all of the agencies cooperatively working together in the state of California on wildland fire. Emergency management organizations, local groups and organizations, and state and federal agencies as well. 1976, the National Wildfire Coordinating Group was established nationally. It used the model in California to bring federal and state agencies to the table to talk about how to better coordinate programs, training, and firefighting efforts nationally. A lot of discussion with Yarnell and the use of fire shelters. The first fire shelters were utilized in 1977, and you're going to hear, especially in this coming year, a lot of talk about fire shelters as it relates to the fatalities with the Granite Mountain hotshot crew. I'm just going to run by these other key elements quickly. 1985, we saw the first kind of bringing together all of the management systems to better deal with wildland fire. This is a system now that's used by FEMA. All of the emergency management organizations in the United States are kind of under this same umbrella that was developed in 1985 by the wildland fire community. 1988 was the year the media really engaged and began to understand the issue of wildland fire with the fire in Yellowstone that burned most of the summer. 1991, historically, again, the first billion-dollar wildland urban interface fire in the United States in Berkeley, California. 3,000 homes, apartments burned, $1.5 billion in damage on top of the $1 billion in fire suppression costs, and 24 people died in that fire. 1994 is another important date as you think about wildland fire. This was July 2nd on the South Canyon Fire here in Colorado. It was a small fire in terms of acreage compared to today's fires. 14 firefighters died in that fire as a result of erratic fire behavior. This was the Prineville, Oregon hotshot crew, and really kind of, again, refined how wildland fires were being dealt with as fires within and adjacent to communities, and how wildland firefighters responded. 2004, Alaska, 6.5 million acres burned. It was quiet. Not very many people realized that was happening. It was the highest total of acres burned of any wildland urban interface fire in the United States. 2006, we saw Texas. 2007, we were in Southern California again with 500,000 people evacuated with some of the fires in Southern California, the largest mass evacuation for wildland fire in history at that particular time. 2011, the wildland fire problem moved to Texas. And in 2012, back to Colorado. All of you that are from here know Waldo Canyon really was kind of the largest fire in Colorado history at that point in time. Also fires in New Mexico, and additional fires later in Colorado gave Colorado firefighting efforts a real challenge in 2012. And then I've already talked about this past year how Prescott and the Granite Mountain hotshot crew being the 19 firefighters dying in that 8,000 acre fire really now has kind of turned the attention back to how we're dealing with wildland fire and fire protection for homes and people. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about how the world is changing and how wildland fire is changing as well. And I think I want to share with you some statistics and I hope kind of help bring into perspective a little clearer picture of the whole wildland fire problem in the United States. The structural fire departments in the United States have done a terrific job. Over the last few years, we have initiated a lot of programs that have really helped bring down the number of structure fires in the United States. So it's on a decline. But on the other side of the triangle, the number of wildland fires continues to grow at really kind of alarming rates, and I'm going to share some of that with you here in just a couple minutes. Why is this happening? And it's been talked about here in previous discussions, and I think that it's the same with wildland fire. Extreme weather conditions we're seeing in just about every part of the country. When we talk about these wildland fires, we're looking at weather conditions that are typically not normal in the scenario of how these communities have had to deal with these kind of fires in the past. We're not only talking about that, we're talking about communities in fire-prone forest areas where they weren't before, on top of extreme weather conditions. Drought is a huge issue. It's been talked about in the news this morning in relationship to the fires in Southern California with the red flag warnings. The combination of drought and extreme weather and insect and disease damage. Mountain pine beetle here in Colorado, in Idaho, in Montana, where huge blocks of forests have been subjected to mountain pine beetle and are causing major problems in dealing with some of the fire suppression efforts. And we hear this concept of megafires, and megafires meaning, fires that typically over the last, several decades, other than some of the large fires that we just talked about historically, have not been to the degree they are today. They're being fueled by extreme weather. They're being fueled by drought. They're being fueled by insect and disease damage, by forests that have fuel loadings that are far above what the historic levels have been. And these megafires are unbelievable. When you look at some of these fires around the country, they tend to really kind of emphasize this issue that we have a huge problem nationally to deal with. In any fire presentation I do, I have to show air tanker pictures because everybody loves to see air tankers. And as a result of that earlier slide that I talked about when air tankers first were used in firefighting in the Forest Service back in the early 1900s, air tankers carried 200 gallons of water. In today's world, that's changing. And I think when we talk about firefighting efforts in the United States today, this is a DC-10, 10,000 gallons of retardant that this aircraft carries. It's $1 million decision for local governments to deal to engage these kind of aircraft in today's firefighting efforts. And then you have the 747 on top of that carries 24,000 gallons of retardant at $4 a gallon, $5 probably this year. It's an expensive operation. And I just finished workshops in 18 states talking with communities, county commissioners, homeowners about planning for wildland urban interface fires in the future. And everybody talks about the importance of air tankers, but people don't understand how much it costs and what the technology is all about. And so we're really trying to kind of get the message out that the firefighting efforts in today's world of megafires is a mix of not only air tankers, but helicopters and ground forces as well. Question? The question was, why does retardant cost $5 a gallon? That's the delivery cost for the aircraft and the cost of the chemical retardant itself. It hasn't really gone up in price a lot over the last few years in terms of the price of retardant itself, but when you use really high price aircraft, that cost goes up substantially.
What is the retardant, the orange stuff?
It's just a fertilizer based product that has a red dye. So there is a lot of controversy about that. as well. I think that we've seen a lot of discussion nationally about the use of retardant near lakes and streams and rivers, and that is built into the equation now, where you won't see as much retardant used near live streams for that particular reason. I think it's interesting, 10 years ago in the United States, and this is important, I think, for the media folks, the meteorologists in the room that are from the local, networks around, or the local TV stations from around the country. The issue with air tankers is huge. If wildland firefighting is occurring and the public does not see air tankers on that fire, the assumption is that wildfire fighting efforts are inferior for that group of people dealing with that fire, that they're missing the stage of dealing with that. And so we have to kind of go back in time. We had 44 air tankers nationally 10 years ago. We have 11 today. So on top of having larger, more devastating wildfires burning near cities, towns, communities, subdivisions, this toolbox that we have is getting more and more limited. At the same time, it's getting more and more complicated. When we have 20 or 30 fires burning in the United States, trying to prioritize who gets the issue or who gets the air tankers is huge. And we see a lot of discussion about that. I think that came out in the investigation for the Yarnell fire, and you've seen it happen in the fire here that I'm showing in Colorado, where air tankers were scarce. It took a while to get them in, and again, it's just one tool in a toolbox of many tools. Helicopters are the same situation, which I think it's good to understand. Every helicopter in the United States, 411 helicopters that are used for wildland firefighting, everything that can be contracted is contracted. There are very few during the fire season helicopters available that are not tied to wildfire fighting efforts. I always throw this picture in because I can never figure out, really what's happening there, but it's really a cool picture. A person that was on a lead plane. A lead plane is the plane that takes the air tanker or helicopter into a specific fire area, and somebody poked their camera out the back and took a picture of that.
Yeah, that was awesome. Can you show that again just for a second?
Yeah. And the air tanker there is a dipper, one of the aircraft that will fly into a river or lake and scoop up water.
What's the helicopter?
The helicopter is, I'm not actually really sure.
What's the horsepower on that helicopter?
Yeah, I don't know, but I think if you zoom in on the pilot's face, I don't think he realizes what's going on behind him. Again, I think as we talk about these mega fires and the issue of fires that are affecting communities across the United States, these are the scenes that we're seeing today, and the types of fires that we're having to deal with, and the smoke issues that firefighters are having to deal with today. I think it's important as we talk about mega fires and wildland urban interface fires in the United States, and we just get out of the segment about talking about air tankers and helicopters, which we usually see in every video clip about wildland fires in the United States, that we're really working, I think the wildland fire community, the structural fire community, and others in the United States, to try to get the message out to the media that we've got to talk about other aspects of wildland fire. And I think that when ABC News came to us to talk about how this issue could be talked about in a little bit more proactive way, that they did a great job in showing a house with a metal roof. They didn't go into all the detail about how much the homeowner had done ahead of time before the fire, but we're seeing more and more coverage like this that's helping the community members and the homeowners living in these wildland urban interface areas understand the ramifications of wildland fire, and because of issues in other parts of the country, we're starting to see the attention of other communities understanding how to deal with this whole wildland fire issue in a more realistic and understandable way. Example of, I think, some really good coverage. One of the issues this past year in 2013, mega fires kind of went away and celebrity fires kind of came into play, quietly being talked about, because within the fire protection agencies at the federal, state, and local level, there was a feeling that all of the celebrity fires got the most attention. A lot of the other types of fires didn't. And so there was a lot of kind of discussion about if you had a fire that had a ski area or movie stars living in it, that it got a lot of national attention. Some of the 100 or 200,000 acre fires didn't. And I think that I like it though, because I think it again focuses on getting the story out about how important communities need to be thinking in terms of how to deal with these kinds of fires. What I want to talk about is a couple things in relationship to kind of the issue of firefighters again. We have, as we talked about with the Yarnell and the Granite Mountain hotshots and some of the historic wildland fires, have seen an increasing number of fatalities, not only for first responders and firefighters, but for the public as well. And I think that as we talk about the issue of wildland fire, it's important to understand that this is a growing problem in the United States that agencies and organizations are trying to, to get a handle on. It's not only in the firefighting forces, but in the aerial firefighting forces as well, with a lot of air tankers and other types of issues. It's a common picture that we're seeing on a lot of fires where after the fire, we're in there looking for people that decided to stay and protect their home, that their evacuation routes were cut off, and they died as a result of not being able to get out in time or trying to protect their property. I want to talk about the numbers, because I think as we talk about wildland fire, this kind of helps put things into perspective from some of the things we've talked about already. And I want you to think about this. In the United States, we roughly have about 100,000 wildland fires a year. 100,000 wildland fires a year. Within that 100,000 fires, we have, and those 100,000 wildland fires burn about 7 million acres on average. This is an interesting fact that doesn't get talked about very often. 100,000 fires, 97,000 of those 100,000 fires are put out at less than 10 acres in size. 100,000 fires, 97,000 are put out at less than 10 acres. 3%, 3,000 fires roughly, are the biggest, the most expensive, and are the ones that are causing the fatalities in the United States. A lot of people talk about how that is an important figure to think about. There's no other country in the world that comes close to that percentage of dealing with that many fires effectively. But it's important to understand that that small percentage account for all of the major fires that are wildland urban interface fires in the United States.
Dan? Just a quick question. I'm wondering how you think, since those fires are relatively small in size, that you brought up with that point, how do you see the coordination evolving with the firefighting community and the National Weather Service, for example?
I think every presentation that's occurred during this summit is important because it fits into the wildland equation just as well. It's so important to engage the community and all of the players in dealing with this problem. It's the only way it's ever going to work. And I'll tell you that it's not, and when I go through these figures, you'll see that it's not going away, and that we need to really kind of focus on everybody working on the issue. I think that it was the first time I heard about Weather Ready Nation, and I've engaged in all kinds of programs and on several boards of other groups and organizations around the country, and it's great. That is one of the best pieces of information that I gained from the workshop here, because I think it fits well with what we're talking about within the wildland fire community. And the weather meteorologists around the country, the National Weather Service, are already engaged in this issue. It's just trying to bring it into the fold a little bit better and provide more information.
And this is Chris Strager, National Weather Service. And if I can just expand on that a little bit, for those in the audience and in a room that may not know some of the efforts, for each of the 122 offices, forecast offices across the country, they're all engaged with their local emergency management. They can each issue spot forecasts that are derived from our, I spoke on Monday about our National Digital Forecast Database. Is we have new models coming in that get down to a finer resolution and a finer temporal scale, like the HER coming up. They're going to be able to implement that into those local spot fires. And Dan, that's one of the things, I think one of the very first ways for us to get out there and address this. But in addition, we also have a permanent staff that's out in Boise, and we have over 100 incident meteorologists trained to be able to go out and deploy to sites to provide on-site information to the firefighters during this event. And we're also trying to learn more with international cooperation. We have a reciprocal agreement with Australia where we sponsor every other year. Somebody from the Australia firefighting group, meteorologists, will come to United States, and we will send somebody down to share techniques and also assist so that we're keeping up to date on the latest techniques.
That's a really good point. And I think, again, going back and looking at 1933 when we first engaged with the National Weather Service, with the weather part of the equation, I think we've had a good, solid relationship. I think the future is even going to be better. I was one of the national incident commanders. There's roughly 16 national teams that deal with the largest fires, the hurricanes, the tornadoes. And I was an incident commander of a team for about 12 years with the federal government. And I'll tell you, when you go out on these types of emergencies, it takes everybody kind of working together with the communities. And you're camped out. You have your little tent out in the middle of a field, someplace in the middle of nowhere. Anybody have any idea whose tent that I wanted really close to mine as being kind of the leader of that team? The meteorologist assigned to the fire. Because I figured if he got up in the middle of the night and was having some kind of a problem, that it would wake me up and realize that I needed to be kind of engaged in that discussion. I am a firm believer in the on-site meteorologists in these types of incident situations. It's rock solid.
Matt Safino of KGW Portland. Wildfire is part of the ecosystem in the western United States, and historically the western forests and rangelands have been subjected to frequent low-intensity fires that actually did a lot of good by removing fuels and creating a buildup of fuels which will lead to these catastrophic high-intensity fires. And so some believe that wildfire suppression is actually part of the problem. Obviously, if property and lives are threatened, then action needs to be taken. Can you talk a little bit about the decision process, if it's even considered whether or not to let it burn to add to the health of the forest when property and lives are not threatened?
Excellent question. I'll give you my perspective. From the standpoint of being one of the national incident commanders for many years and dealing with dealing with wildland fires, I'll tell you what has happened over the years. It used to be pretty simple. Wildland fires were tucked out in the middle of nowhere, not near communities, not near homes, and it was pretty simple. Nobody cared about them. We were able to allow some fires to burn more naturally and kind of herd the fires around. As times have changed and we've watched populations grow and move to these high hazard interface areas, that equation has changed. One of the reasons that you see huge wildland fires in terms of acreages today, 100,000, 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 acre fires, is because when you again go back to the discussion that we had a few minutes ago for the toolbox of the air tankers and the helicopters and all of the resources that you have at your fingertips to deal with these fires, we're putting all of the effort in protecting communities, homes, and the rest of the fire is being kind of herded into areas that are allowing those fires to get bigger, not burning under the conditions that we would like to see in terms of more natural conditions. Some of these areas where in the past we had fire intervals of natural, in terms of fire ecology, fires occurring every 5 to 10 years. What's happened, you go back to that 1935 policy that I talked about earlier where fires were put out by 10 a.m. the following day. That policy set into motion unnatural fuel loading levels in a lot of forests around the United States, especially in the West, where we're not able to utilize fire as easily as we would like to in terms of how intense those fires are burning and how that is affecting the decision making on some of these fires. Does that answer your question?
A little bit.
Is there a follow-up?
Well, I guess I'm just, I understand that, population and communities are expanding in areas where there used to not be there, and that fire suppression to protect communities has to be, those actions have to be taken. So I guess, is there an example of when or where you might say, you know what, we're going to let this burn because there are no communities or homes threatened and it's going to be a benefit long-term to the environment? Many times. You look back at 2012 and 13, a lot of the fires that burned in Idaho and Montana in or adjacent to wilderness areas, roadless areas, that was the strategy. Focus the attention on keeping the fire from burning into the communities and allowing it to burn more naturally in areas where it could be dealt with effectively. So when you do that, do you get blowback for not taking action, I wonder? Yes, you do. And you get blowback from the standpoint you're creating a huge amount of smoke that's not impacting that local area, but it's impacting areas many, many miles away, which is a big issue that I'm going to talk about here in just a couple minutes. What? Oh.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Chris's comments about Weather Service services. The Storm Prediction Center's been issuing national fire weather outlooks for over a decade now. We coordinate those really closely with the geographical area coordination centers and with the meteorologists within other aspects of the fire program, including WFO forecasters. And it includes dry thunderstorm forecasts as well as forecasts of critical and extremely critical areas. So you can check the SPC website for national fire weather forecasts, and those are well coordinated across the enterprise, so they should be consistent.
It's, again, I echo, I really like that comment because I think it strengthens the point I made earlier that over the years there's been a really good tie to that, and it's an important piece. The piece that we're missing now is how we engage the public, and the public better understands that whole piece of the puzzle as well.
Hey, Dan, Jim Cantor, Weather Channel, kind of playing off of what Matt was talking about. Do you have any numbers as to what just burned naturally back in 1900 versus since we started fire suppression?
Coming up.
Okay, well, I guess we'll all stay tuned then, right?
Stay tuned. Again, just talking about the numbers, and I think this will help. 2.3 billion acres in the United States, kind of roughly the land mass. About 1 billion acres of government, federal, state, municipal, privately owned wildlands without structures. About 200 million acres, 220 million acres to be exact, about twice the size of California, have been designated by each state forester as being at really high risk of wild-urban interface. So 2 billion, 1 billion of wildlands, about half of the U.S., and about 220 million acres of wildland-urban interface. This is a map that I like to show because it really highlights the issue of areas prone to wildfire in the United States, especially when you look at Hawaii and Alaska and areas in the southeast and the northeast. Really kind of shows that it is a growing problem. In the western states, this is something I want to kind of sink in. West of the Mississippi, 84% of the lands that are away, and that's a key figure. Headwaters Economics is a group out of Bozeman, Montana. It's a group of economists that are working with Census Bureau data and a lot of information that's helping counties understand what their problems are. And they have a tremendous amount of information if you just Google Headwater Economics for every state. Number of homes that are second homes, the value of the homes. It's a tremendous resource. They're working right now on the eastern part of the United States. Roughly 40%'s been developed, still 60% out there that's not federal lands, that still has the potential over the next decades to be developed and part of this wildland-urban interface fire problem. 72,000 numbers of communities in the United States at risk of wildland fire. This goes back to that 220 million acres that the state foresters in each state have identified, 72,000 communities. 46 million homes located in these 72,000 at-risk communities. 120 million people call the wildland-urban interface home within these 72,000 communities. And I think it really shows the magnitude of this problem, how it's growing from what it's been in the past. And when you look at this chart, what I want you to look at is not really kind of going into a lot of detail, but look at the 1960s decade. Roughly 100 million people in the United States, 25 million people lived in what was called the wildland-urban interface, even though it wasn't termed that back in the 1960s. Today, 120 million, just a little over 300 million for the U.S. population. Think about these pieces as I go through these kind of figures. Average number of fires per decade, where we kind of get into the comment about the question. 1960, you can see that decade. We had not as many really large fires. You can't see that in the chart here, but that's kind of what the figures show. But notice the percentage of fire that decade by year compared to the number of WUI fires. 1960s, 1970s, the wildland-urban interface fire problem begins to grow to where it is today with 10 million acres, and the majority of those acres are wildland-urban interface. Firefighting costs. This is the scary part when we talk about the wildfires today. The 1960s, 70s, 80s, the 1990s, where we started to see, the real issue of wildland fire and the costs starting to escalate. But what I want you to look at here is the yellow being federal, the blue being state, and the orange being the impacts to local communities. This is what's causing some of the problems that we're facing today in dealing with this wildland-urban interface issue. It's not just a federal problem, it's a state problem, and it's a local problem as well. And as in any situation that you see, one of the things that I loved being with the International Association of Wildland Fire and some of the other groups is that I don't have to, sugarcoat things. The federal government is moving away from dealing with wildland-urban interface fires because they're focusing resources on not federal or state lands. They're focusing resources on private lands, which is not part of the mission. So you're going to see over the next decade not only the issue of how these costs are escalating, but also this shift in responsibility, more responsibility to local communities to engage in dealing with this problem themselves. So on top of more acres, more WUI, 70,000 communities, 146 million people, firefighting is changing as well. In 2013, we had 18,000 wildland firefighters at the peak of the season. In the 1990s, we had about 25,000 wildland firefighters out there dealing with some of these fires, and you can see what the trend is. Wildland firefighters at the federal level are going down. At the state level, going down. We're seeing more involvement from volunteer and rural fire departments that are becoming more engaged in dealing with this issue as well. And we're seeing contractors and insurance companies coming into play in dealing with these fires. So it's just changing the complexion of how we deal with these types of fires. Structures lost. 1960s, we were losing about 200 homes a year during that decade to wildland fire. Today, it's just a little bit under 3,000 homes lost to wildland urban interface fire each year, and it's growing. Insurance companies over the years have not been engaged much in the wildland fire problem until this started happening in this chart that you see right here. The 1980s, there was not much occurring. 1990s, the claims, the number of houses, all of a sudden got the insurance companies more engaged in dealing with the problem. Today, insurance companies are scratching their head trying to figure out how to better deal with people living in these high-risk wildland urban interface areas. These 18 state meetings that I talked about that have occurred over the last few years, or a few months of last year, really emphasize the point that insurance companies are getting engaged. In Virginia, in Alabama, and here in Colorado, insurance companies have sent out hundreds of thousands of letters to policyholders in wildland urban interface areas saying what needs to be done, giving policyholders 12 to 24 months to do certain things to improve the safety of their property. And if they don't, policies are being canceled, and people are having to deal with situations that are different than what they've had to deal with in the past.
Hey, Dan, Paul Goodlow with the Weather Channel. A few frames back, you showed the number of wildfires, and it almost seems as though they've doubled since the 1960s, the 2000s. Why? Is it more people in the wildlands? Is it perhaps climate related? Why are there so many more wildfires?
I think the issue is that we're seeing more people in areas that typically have not lived in those areas before, where in the West, lightning has been the primary kind of focus of a lot of the wildland fires that we've had. Today, that equation is changing. We're seeing a lot more fires caused by people, which are, when you add that to the equation with people and severe weather, it's causing more and more fires that agencies are having to deal with.
Ned Gardner, Climate Program Office. Just a simple answer, at least for California, one of the first things I did with Storm Center 10 years ago was we looked at Santa Ana winds and wildfires in California. It scales linearly with roads, is the number of fires. So roads being built into the wildland urban interface scale directly, linearly with the number of fires and acres burned.
That's good, and we're seeing that same thing happen, nationally, other states as well. I just want to briefly talk about the last couple of years to, again, kind of help put things into perspective of these 100,000 fires that we talked about earlier. 67,000 fires, that was the number of wildland fires in 2012, 45,000 fires this past year. I'm going to go through these quickly, because I'm just about ready to wrap up here. 9.3 million acres burned in 2012, about 4.2 million acres in 2013. $3.1 billion spent in suppressing wildland fires in 2012. $2.9 billion in this past year, with about half of the fires that we had in 2012. Back to that cost issue, and a lot of those costs at local and state jurisdictions. A lot of research is occurring right now in relationship to the costs of wildland fire. Research is saying that when you see $3.1 billion spent in 2012 for wildland fire suppression, that's about 20% of the actual cost of wildland fire costs for that year. 20%, $3.1 billion is about 20% of the real cost. There is the issue of rehabbing these large fires, which are extremely expensive, the implications of flooding and the water quality issues in relationship to these fires, impacts to communities, impacts to businesses, and the list goes on and on. You're going to be seeing more and more discussion about the true costs of wildland-urban interface fire. And this is the thing that I think within the wildland fire community is really a hard issue to kind of grasp. 36 fatalities in 2012. Half of those were civilian fatalities. 33 in 2013. Just this week in Australia, we had several fatalities again and some bushfires in that particular part of the country. Not only affecting first responders and wildland firefighters, but the public as well. And it comes back to some of the things that were talked about in previous discussions with impacts on evacuation, impacts on how a lot of people do not want to leave their house, they want to stay and protect it, and all the problems associated with that. 4,200 homes lost in 2012, 2,200 lost last year. So, I just want to wrap up by talking about, today's wildland-urban interface fires are impacting more than just homes, people, and forests. This is what we're seeing around the country. And these are the kind of subdivisions that look like they're fire-wise, fire-safe, fire-free, but we're finding that these high-intensity, wind-driven fires are burning in these kind of situations, and we're seeing communities like this are burning where community members have no inkling that they're in a wildfire-prone area. Time after time over the last 5 years, these kind of fires that occurred here in Colorado, in Montana, in the Northeast are showing that these kind of fires are taking the toll, not only with communities, but with having to understand how construction methods and fire-safe and fire-wise efforts need to kind of be blended in to deal with this in a little more effective way. We talked about smoke a few minutes ago, and I think this is going to be one of the biggest issues facing everyone in the future. This is a smoke column from a fire just out of Los Angeles, but we're seeing these kind of fires have major effects on highways, in communities, in states that have not really in the past seen the kind of smoke issues that we've seen occurring in the last couple years. I really like this slide because I think it shows the fires in 2013 and what states were impacted by the smoke. Federal agencies and local communities are really engaging in the health issues relating to smoke and how this kind of fits all of the pieces of the puzzle. And I think, again, we're going to see this. When you go back and look at the historic fires that we talked about a little earlier, in the 1960s and the 1970s, about half of the fires that occurred during that period of time were small, burning kind of freely, so to speak, not associated with high population areas, didn't generate the kind of smoke that the fires are generating today. So we're seeing more implications from that being a major issue. Also, it's not just about houses. Major power lines are being impacted by fires that we have not seen in the past. And this is not impacting the community. This is impacting power grids all over the country. We're seeing the same thing happening with mountaintop cell towers, satellite uplinks, and even in the oil field, the pipelines in Alaska. We've watched the wildfire problem really kind of help better understand how oil companies need to be more engaged in dealing with shutting off the major pipelines during large-scale wildland fires. And many of you have seen this site around the country, more and more wind turbines, and I like to end on this one because I think it really kind of sums up how technology is really kind of fitting in respect to all of the other issues with wildland-urban interface fire, especially in the Pacific Northwest. Millions and millions of dollars of wind turbines. The engineers that put these in had no idea that many of these were put into areas that were prone to wildfire. They're built from a construction standpoint with plastic. When these range fires happen in some of these areas around the states of Oregon and Washington and Idaho and other parts of the country as well, the wind generated by the fire sucks the fire into the wind turbines, and at about $1.5 million each, they find that they don't relate to fire very well, and in the last couple years has been a real issue with a lot of the fires in the Pacific Northwest and how companies are trying to get a better handle on dealing with this. So, as we look to the future, I think that we will continue to see more and more wildland-urban interface fires affecting communities and people. I think that we're really kind of focusing on how to engage people. 70,000 communities, as I talked about earlier, are at high risk of wildland-urban interface fire in the United States. 10% of those 70,000 communities have developed some kind of a community wildfire protection plan or have adopted a building code or a wildland-urban interface code for their communities. So we're just scratching the surface in working with communities in terms of dealing with this growing problem. And we really, I think, what I got out of the workshop this week is that we really need to engage all of you here in the room today and out watching this live to engage in this problem and help get the word out and work with communities in understanding what this problem is all about and providing a good sound bit of knowledge in working at trying to get some of these issues resolved. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
So if anybody has questions, please raise your hand. We'll distribute the microphones again. That was terrific, Dan. Thank you so much. We have about 20 minutes for questions, and we'll go ahead. We'll start with Howard.
Howard Bernstein, WUSA in Washington. How difficult is it to get building codes changed? Because you see these asphalt shingle roofs, and I'm thinking they're just ready to go. It's like the eucalyptus trees that were planted in California years ago with the oily leaves. How much do you get resistance from local governments on the building code changes? Or are they becoming more and more receptive to that?
Resistance.
Why?
I think that every part of the United States is a little bit different. In some states, like California, are quite a ways ahead in dealing with this, with adopting codes statewide. But when you look at the 70,000 communities they just talked about, and you only have less than 10% that have done something, that says that you have a long ways to go. I think that a lot of people are reluctant to do anything that resembles planning for the future, to be perfectly honest. I think that I go back and I look at my years as an incident commander, and I'll tell you the last few years that I did it as we began to move more and more into areas where homes and people lived, I'll tell you what people were telling me in public meetings. We don't care if our house burns, but we don't want that view shed. We don't want that view that's out our living room window destroyed, and a black, candle, black, stumps and trees for the next 30 years. And so people, I think, the attitude is changing on that. I think the issue that I talked about where the federal government's trying to get out of dealing with the wildland-urban interface because it's not really in their kind of best interest, because it's not part of their overall responsibility for federal lands, pushing county commissioners and mayors and councils to be more engaged in looking at the options for building codes and putting the burden on the local communities to deal with this.
The only thing I'll follow up is my county, about a decade ago, mandated fire sprinklers inside the homes, but they didn't do anything for anything outside the homes.
And you see that, I think, in many places around the country as well. I think that, again, I think the tide's changing in that. People are beginning to understand the importance of that. I think anytime you adopt a new code or standard, it's for new home construction. It's not for existing home construction, which is key. And a lot of people don't understand that. These 18 state meetings that I talked about earlier, this was the purpose of those meetings, talking to community members, politicians, and others about why this is a good system, how to kind of work with homeowners and looking forward rather than kind of after the fact and reacting.
Greg Setzer from CBS in Miami. I can't help but think there's some overlap between the hurricane evacuation zone problem and the wildfire problem. And what sense do you have of people that don't even know that they live in a wildfire hazard area? They're just completely unaware of the possibility that it could occur.
Huge. And again, I go back to these 18 statewide meetings where 100 or 200 people in a meeting, and people did not understand the ramifications of living in these high risk interface areas. Didn't understand the importance of looking at that ahead of time, evacuation, how those kind of things were being dealt with. And I think it comes back to what I said earlier. It's really, really important to blend all of the things that we've been talking about for the last few days together to give the public a better understanding of how to deal with all of these aspects.
Jim White, University of Colorado, following up on this theme, one of the things that the rest of us don't realize is that we subsidize through our insurance policies folks living in harm's way, and this is beginning to become an issue in coastal communities. The costs are several $1,000s a year that basically subsidize people to live on the coast. And I think the same, and you're getting pushback because of that. And, living here in Colorado, what I've not heard is just how much I pay. I don't live in a fire area, but how much do I pay for, for Tom Hanks to live in a fire zone? I mean, and I do pay. And that's where you start to get, I think, community rallying behind, these regulations saying, maybe we don't want to subsidize that.
Well, and that's a great point, because I think that's exactly right. And it goes back to the comment I made earlier about the insurance companies being more engaged now than they've been in the past. That's helping more than anything that we have seen occur in the last 10 years, because insurance companies, and all of the major companies are doing it, are sending out these letters telling people that they live in high wildland fire risk areas. They're actually doing inspections on the homes and telling them what they have to do to bring it up to compliance. And if they don't, they're losing their policies. And a lot of people are in a lot of different states are seeing this as kind of an emphasis to be more proactive in planning for wildland fire and some of these other emergencies that we've talked about as well. I think, again, this all kind of blends together.
But just to follow up on that, I mean, we're seeing today, for example, in Sandy area, people are building back in areas where they shouldn't be building. And so this is until they cannot get insurance, I don't think we're going to stop people from doing it.
Well, that's happening on the coast. There's legislation on the coast now that's...
No microphone?
It is controversial, but there is legislation that's due to be implemented this year that will require people to assume the burden of their own insurance for coastal development.
In what jurisdiction?
In the East Coast of the United States. It's coming. So New Jersey people, for instance, are seeing huge hikes in their insurance rates, potentially. And so this issue is very actively happening on the policy level right now.
Well, and I think for those that are from California, that you already know this, but California has pretty much shut off writing any new policies in wildland urban interface areas, period. They made that decision. And I think that that is having a ripple effect in other states around the edges as people are seeing their policies double in price or seeing it canceled or having to go to another company with far less coverage in dealing with that issue.
Dan, Howard Bernstein again, Washington. Is there any grant money or low-interest loans out for some of these places with the insurance companies? You were saying you must bring your homes up into compliance or you're going to lose your coverage. Is there any programs to help homeowners who may not have, $10,000 lying around to replace their roof or whatever it may cost?
In some states, there are. And I think that there's more grant money that people can apply for to do kind of fuels and vegetation management around their structure, more so than replacing a roof and other types of kind of building, construction kind of upgrades. But, some states are, focusing on that as well. But most of the grant money is associated with removing the outside fire hazard around your residence. And again, as everything else in the world is changing, the amount of grant money is starting to dry up, and a lot of that emphasis that has been there in the past is not going to be there in the future at a time when more fires and more people moving to these interface areas, that it will become even more difficult to deal with.
Dan, just one question from online, and then we can move on. Can you tell us whether we need to be concerned about urban wildland interface fires when we live in major metropolitan areas?
Yes, you should be. Another trend that's happening here in the United States are small 40 or 50 acre fires that are burning 10, 20, 30 acre or 10, 20 or 30 homes at a time. And what's happening, these smaller fires are happening in Boston, Chicago, in a lot of the major cities that people typically are not seeing in relationship to how past wildland urban interface fires have dealt with. You look at the fire I just talked about when I opened up the presentation in Kansas, same thing. You don't think of wildland urban interface fires in Kansas, but it is occurring. What's different about these fires and should really kind of engage the community is that these kind of fires are very short duration, 4 to 6 to 8 hours, and they cannot mobilize, large teams to manage these. These are managed by the local fire department or the local federal or state agency, and all of that damage occurs in a very short period of time before, major kind of mobilization can occur where you're talking about large, population areas.
So one other online question asking, can you make any relationship between changing climate and the increased number of wildfires?
It's a huge effect. In the last 10 years, all you have to do is look at the statistics to really kind of understand how this issue is really starting to drive the number and size and frequency of these types of wildland urban interface fires. So the future doesn't look to change in that at all. We're going to see more as a result of the weather patterns and these really critical weather conditions.
Any other questions in the room here? Dan, thank you very much.
Thank you.